Good evening and welcome on this cold but really beautiful April evening at Lake Wannsee. My name is Nana Bahlmann and I am the Senior Advisor Arts Program here at the American Academy, which means that I basically deal with everything or most things arts related. Thank you for joining us for tonight's John P. Birkeland lecture, Making Visible the Art of Ceija Stojka by Lynne Cooke, independent curator and writer, and former senior curator of modern art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. It is my real pleasure to welcome our trustees, Professor Regine Leibinger and Christine Wallig, and many artists, curators, gallerists, and friends from the art world here in Berlin and worldwide. Before I introduce Michael Diers, who will in turn introduce Lynne tonight, I would like to briefly share a few words about the fellowship which has made tonight's event possible. The John P. Birkeland Fellowship was established 15 years ago in February 2011 with a generous gift from John P. Birkeland to promote German-American dialogue in the humanities. Past recipients have been, among others, literary scholar San Nai, curator and theorist Ariella Azoulay, Germanist Johannes von Moltke, historian John Connelly, and others. The late John P. Birkeland supported the American Academy in Berlin in myriad ways and was a longtime member of our Board of Trustees. Birkeland's interest in the humanities showed through his philanthropic support for other institutions as well, such as the National Humanities Center, the Frick Collection, Princeton University, New York Public Library, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of course, the American Academy in Berlin. We are honored to have Lynne Cooke as our John P. Birkeland Fellow this semester. And we are honored to have Michael Diers with us tonight to introduce her. Michael is an art historian, critic, and professor emeritus of art history. He studied art history, literature, and philosophy in Münster and Hamburg, where he received his doctorate with a thesis on Abi Warburg. Since the 1990s, he has taught at different universities in Germany, including the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, Humboldt University in Berlin, and the HFBK in Hamburg. He has taught generations of, and that is really unusual, both art historians and artists, serving as professor of art history and history of the image at the University of Visual Arts Hamburg, while simultaneously also serving as adjunct professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. His teaching and research span Renaissance, modern, and contemporary art, with a strong emphasis on photography, film, and new media, as well as political iconography, image theory, and intellectual history. Michael is a prolific writer. He's the author of well over 200 essays and articles, as well as numerous books and lectures, and has played an editorial role in major scholarly series, including the collected writings of Abi Warburg. He's a regular contributor to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Die Zeit, Monopol, and others. His recent books include Mary Warburg, Leben, Werk, Porträt einer Künstlerin, together with Bärbel Hedinger, who's also here tonight, and Gegen den Strich, Die Kunst und ihre politischen Formen from 2023, reflecting his continued engagement with image theory and political iconography. His 2024 book, Auf offener Straße, Irpin, Kiew, received the Silver Medal of the German Photo Book Award. It is a deep reflection on one iconic photograph from the war in Ukraine, which was published by the New York Times in early 2022. And so before I hand over to Michael, let me just quickly explain the format of this evening. After Michael's introduction, Lynne will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. And after her talk, you will have a chance to ask questions. So please raise your hand and wait for the microphone and make sure that your question is indeed a question. And dear Michael, the floor is all yours.
Hello to everybody. I'm not a lecturer because the introduction was so fulminant that I'm very honored to be here. Dear Nana, dear Lynne, Thank you very much for the invitation and your kind words. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today, Lynne Cooke, currently a fellow at the American Academy. I first met Lynne many years ago when she was a curator at the Dia Art Foundation. She welcomed me and the students with whom I had taken a field trip to New York to the foundation's magnificent branch, Dia Beacon, in the Hudson Valley, and gave us a tour of the collections. I believe there was a special focus on works by Agnes Martin at the time, an exhibition curated, of course, by our guest. Lynne captivated all the participants, the students, me, with her kindness, her knowledge, and her charm. But who is this renowned, indeed famous art historian and curator, who as early as 2006 received the award for curatorial excellence from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in New York, an accolade, German Ritterschlag, previously bestowed upon figures such as Harald Seemann, Caspar Koenig, or Walter Hobbs, to name just a few colleagues. Lynne Cooke was born in Australia, specifically in Geelong. I hope I pronounce it correctly. A major city in the Australian state of Victoria. She earned her BA in Melbourne before moving to London to pursue her MA and later her PhD in art history at the renowned Courtauld Institute of the University of London, then located next to the Warburg Institute. We could have met there as well. Her dissertation was devoted to the early work of Willem de Kooning. As a student, as early as 1974, a long time ago, she co-curated the exhibition, A Room of One's Own, 3 Women Artists, with fellow students at the George Payton Gallery in Melbourne, an exhibition that helped launch the Australian women's art movement. I mention this exhibition, I haven't seen it, because it already highlights a central, not least political aspect of Lynne's curatorial work, the promotion and visibility of women artists. She continued to pursue this idea, this agenda in her later work by exhibiting and writing about artists such as Joubert, Louise Bourgeois, Bridget Riley, Agnes Martin, and so on. German artists Rosemarie Trockel and Katharina Fritsch also belong in this context. To accomplish all this, a position at a renowned institution was necessary. She initially found one at the Dia Art Foundation in New York, where Lynne served as chief curator from 1991 to 2008. Prior to that, she had spent about a decade in London as a lecturer in the history department at University College of London, the London University, where she taught and conducted research. And then she made the leap across the Atlantic, marking the transition from Australia and Europe to the third continent of her career. Here in the US, she became one of the most well-known and influential curators of her time, and in between also served as co-curator of the Venice Biennial in 1986, and then 10 years later as director of the Biennale of Sydney. Time and again, she has featured female artists, including Jessica Stockholder, Anne Hamilton, and Ronnie Horn. From New York, Lynne then moved back to Europe, to Spain, specifically Madrid, where she worked for 4 years as chief curator at the Museo Reina Sofia. I met her there once for a coffee as well. So I followed her in a way. But Lynne's career knows no downtime. It just keeps going, soaring upward. She moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as Andrew Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts Kaswa at the National Gallery, and soon after became Senior Curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art. Here, among other things, she conducted research on the topic Outliers and American Vanguard Art, an exhibition in Washington, Atlanta, and Los Angeles exploring the relationship between mainstream and self-taught artists, another older term, perhaps folk artists in the United States from the early 20th century to the present. Another exhibition, again, not a monographic solo show, but a thematic and group exhibition, has turned the attention to the theme of woven histories. The catalog is on show in the entrance. Starting in 2023, and has explored this exhibition, the relationship between textile art and art of modernism, abstraction, so-called high art. The exhibition was shown in Los Angeles, Washington, New York, and Ottawa under the title Woven Histories, Textiles and Modern Abstraction. It should be clear that in addition to her publications and lectures, Lynne Cooke, as a curator, sought to establish a new balance in the canon of modern and contemporary art. On the one hand, through her commitment to issues surrounding women's art, and on the other hand, regarding the art of so-called outsider, or in earlier times it was called primitive artists. Added to this is the attempt to demonstrate how close the artistic ties are between, in German, Kunstgewerbe, applied arts, and so-called high art. Tonight, we will explore another contribution from this thematic area, one that focuses on an outsider, if we may call her that, and her art. Ceija Stojka may not yet be a very familiar name to many of us, but we will see it's important to finally get to know the person, her poetry, and her art. Incidentally, one of the first exhibitions of her work took place in Berlin in 2014. Matthias Reichelt, who did the show together with Liz Ballmann, is here this evening as well. And still running at the Drawing Center in New York is Lynne's exhibition about Stojka's work, reviewed and prized in a very, very long article in the New York Times. Thank you very much for listening. Lynne, the microphone is yours. We are really looking forward to your lecture, and perhaps we'll have time for a cup of coffee or glass of wine afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I also want to thank Dan Benjamin, Johanna Gallup, Nana Baumann, and the wonderful team at the Academy for providing an ideal environment for writing and research, and my fellow fellows for stimulating discussions. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge the generous assistance offered by Matthias Reichelt, and you've just heard Mikhail explain about this important 2014 show and the catalogue that was produced, which remains an indispensable resource for anyone working on Stojka. The focus of this talk is the survey exhibition, which is currently at the Drawing Center, Ceija Stojka, Making Visible. The show aims to introduce the work of the Austrian-born Roma artist to audiences in the US, where it's little known, and especially to those engaged with contemporary art, who make up the majority of visitors to the Drawing Center. By extension, it situates Stojka's work within discourses of modern and contemporary art, highlighting her contribution to the larger issues that her art raises. Or Jason Farago, in a 2020 article for the New York Times, defined as, quote, standing up for the possibility, even the necessity, for human creativity to represent and take ownership of the darkest chapters of our history. Stojka's art addresses the atrocities of the Roma Holocaust under the Third Reich, and by extension, contests claims that would deny not merely its significance and representability, but its very existence. Further, it resists the erasure of her people's cultural traditions and history, and thereby offers powerful models for those faced today with persecution, disenfranchisement, and marginalization. In short, it has its finger on the pulse of our time. Stojka began making art somewhat fortuitously around 1990, when in her late 50s. Though she had no formal training, she took to it and soon began to experiment with materials and processes, improvising by using her fingers and other unorthodox tools. Over the next 2 decades, she created paintings in acrylic and drawings in a variety of mediums. Her preferred support was paper or card, rarely canvas. Initially, she made these works on the kitchen counter in her apartment in Vienna. But around 2000, when she turned her apartment into a live-work studio and the paintings began to take over all of the walls in the rooms of the apartment, her works retained their modest size, almost never exceeding a meter in length. By the time of her death in January 2013, she had made approximately 1,000 works of art. Making Visible, the show's subtitle, speaks not only to the exhibition's goals, but to those of the artist. They were threefold. To make known a genocide denied, that is, the murder of some 500,000 Roma and Sinti under the Nazi regime. In the 90s, when she began to show her work, the poremos, or the devouring, as it was then commonly termed, was rarely discussed among her people. Still today, the Roma Holocaust is ignored or little known in the wider world. Second, she wanted to keep alive knowledge of the traditional Roma way of life and culture, which she'd experienced firsthand as a child when traveling with her family of Lovara horse traders in Lower Austria from 1933, when she was born, through 1938, when the annexation of Austria by Germany, the Anschluss, and related race laws prohibited the Roma from traveling and sought to erase their cultural heritage. And third, she wanted to warn about the rise of neo-fascism in Austria following the election in 1986 of Kurt Waldheim, a former Nazi, to the presidency. The resurgence of alt-right nationalism, in turn, escalated the oppression of the Roma. As she put it in a speech in 2012, Auschwitz is only sleeping. Those goals determined her principal themes, subjects relating to the 3 camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen, where with her mother and siblings, she was interned from March 43 through April 45. Okay. Right. These are 3 camp subjects. Her second theme was what she called a simple Roma life, which she experienced when traveling with her family in the 30s and looked back onto as an idyllic childhood. I'm sorry, these installation photographs are not really as precise as I hoped. They get better. While her paintings memorializing the Holocaust could warn against resurgent fascism, Stojka didn't rely on the past to safeguard the future. From 1993, when her art came to maturity, she began to paint polemical pictures that, in contrast to her normal practice, prioritized politics over poetics. Like banners or placards in their unflinching address, they comprise crude silhouettes, grotesque, goose-stepping stick figures on vibrant monochrome grounds bearing Nazi slogans. In the early 80s, Stojka had begun to record her thoughts and memories on spare pieces of paper and then in notebooks. In 1988, she published her first memoir, We Live in Secrecy, Memories of a Romney Gypsy. It takes the form of anecdotal stories which recount her personal experiences. Suppositions that her fine art, her visual art, suppositions that because she wrote vivid stories in her memoirs and also extensive notes, often of personal kind, on the backs of the paintings, the suppositions that the paintings must be autobiographical is widespread. But close study shows that this is not the case. When making visual art, she worked through memories of formative experiences, self-consciously transmuting and honing the raw material of biography into a poetics. I'm using the phrase working through here to imply an act of critical artistic reflection akin to the ways in which Freud used the term. In so doing, Stojka largely set aside personalized expression and self-representation. So my challenge in making an exhibition was somehow to make a visual argument that makes the case for her achievement as a contemporary artist, as opposed to telling a life story through her artwork, which has been the way most exhibitions have taken place to date. So I want to just point to several interventions I made in the space in order to try and make this art in visual terms. First was to paint the entry wall, which you see here, this deep purple. It's Benjamin Moore's deepest grape. And it gives a certain weight and anchor to the paintings that are hung on it. And as you can see, this is from the threshold into the museum. The purple wall calls you through and takes you past the desks and the books and all the merch. And then the second intervention was to make this middle wall here, which has several advantages. It breaks up the space, but above all, it allowed for paintings to be hung on both sides, which address subjects from the natural world. That is, subjects with a diurnal, seasonal, cyclical time, as distinct from the works that would be around the three perimeter walls, which would focus on historical events and historical time. And then in the far back, there's a smaller gallery, which is the drawings gallery. This is back there. And there's a lower level where two documentary films by award-winning documentaries by the Austrian filmmaker Karin Berger on the subject of Ceija Stojka are screened continuously along with archival material and a chronology. As visitors entered, they were given an exhibition guide which suggested the itinerary through the space, and it also gave them translations of the texts that are on the backs of the paintings. So here you see the opening wall, and now you see better versions of the pictures. The two paintings, the Z6399 is, there's no other painting like this in her work. It immediately identifies her as a survivor of the Holocaust. Her left arm has been tattooed with the registration number she received on entering Auschwitz, and the Z for Zigeuner translates as the derogatory term gypsy. The second work shows the orbiting Earth seen as if from outer space, with the Third Reich coming into view. Craters of pockets surface bear the names of Nazi camps. Stojka's signature hovers over Vienna, lower right, from where she was deported in 1943 and would return after the war. Birds flee a barbed wire perched for other realms. Importantly, these works, or importantly for my argument, these works underscore the modernity of her vision. Their compositional formats bear the unmistakable hallmarks of post-war painting. They mark her as a contemporary artist. Right, this is the other side of that same wall. Here are 4 bucolic landscapes. Their compositions have roots in a tradition of pastoral landscape that originates in 17th century Dutch painting, and by the 20th century had become the stock in trade of vernacular artists. Executed in 1995-96 and realized in her largest format, they show Stojka at the height of her powers as a realist painter. Beginning with spring on the left, the seasonal cycle is loosely based on sites in Lower Austria where the family liked to make camp each year. In spring, summer, and fall, nature serves as a haven for the travelers. This is fall. In winter, on the right, with its abandoned caravans and telltale Nazi flag lying on the snowy ground, depicts the aftermath of the rounding up of a group of travelers. Taken together, the quartet expresses a governing thematic, the symbiotic relation between the Roma and the natural world that was manifest in their traditional way of life and culture and irreparably severed in 1938. These are the only 4 paintings that relate to the traditional life of the Roma in the show. Moving in a clockwise direction, the perimeter walls show a succession of paintings relating to the camps, beginning with Auschwitz-Birkenau. Each is preceded by a depiction of a deportation train. After being arrested and held in transit depots, deportees were crammed into carriages, often cattle cars, devoid of seating, food, water, sanitary facilities, and other provisions needed for extended travel. These transits were the first stage in a ritualized choreography the Nazis devised to humiliate, depersonalize, and dehumanize those whom they regarded as work-shy, alien, in effect as subhuman. Brutalizing and terrifying, the journey from Vienna to Auschwitz over several days proved traumatizing for the 9-year-old Stojka. Beginning in 1994, she repeated this subject a number of times, always in the form of a landscape image. As she worked through her raw materials, her memories and feelings, she accorded nature increasing agency. An effective audience, it responds to the interloper, the transit, with an escalating charge. So in the first, which you see on the left, the electrified barbed wire fence, which is obviously a signifier of confinement that would be particularly hard to a child used to a traveler's life. She made some 6 paintings with this fence over a 5-year career, changing the background, changing the time of day, and so forth. So it's a persistent theme. Just as she made many variants on the transit. But in this case, the train seems merely the conduit for the fence. In the second one, by contrast, from 1995, the roiling storm and the wind whipping the trees on the mountainside ups the emotional register, heralding what's to come when the transit arrives at the terminus of terror. That phrase was written on the back of the painting by Stojka. In the undated third, the transit follows the route from Vienna to Austria, to Auschwitz, also written on the back, that Stojka herself had taken. As she gained mastery of the subject, she gives voice to the feelings of rage and horror that now surged forth. What I'll do now is show you a small selection of the paintings relating to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and follow this by considering 2 works that address the extermination camp from a post-war perspective. So here, this is how you start to move through the room. This is the transportation train, and the first 2 are scenes from within Auschwitz. And I show you here this earlier one called Sad Earth. Very few of the works are titled, as you've probably noticed, and many of them have subtitles, which are taken from text, perhaps on the back or sometimes on the front of the paintings. This is a rare one where she's actually written title here of Sad Earth. Her choice of subjects was deliberately narrow. Most of her camp themes center on forms of brutality. At first glance, Sad Earth, with its bird's eye vantage viewpoint, that's from way up looking down, seems dispassionate, distant psychically as well as physically. Closer inspection, however, shows that it's been elaborated to give effective agency to nature. And we see this in the way the paint drags across and then turns into this kind of vortex on the right, and then the spectral figure in the foreground. So the charge of the painting isn't in the description of what's going on amongst figures. It's really in the way nature becomes the vehicle for that kind of emotional impact. And I want to draw a comparison with Josette Molland's work. Josette Molland was a woman who worked in the silk industry in Lyon in the late 30s. In 1942, she joined the resistance. In 1943, she was outed and deported to Ravensbrück, where Stojka was also at that time. When Molland came back after the war to Lyon, she pursued a career as a professional artist. In the 80s, she started giving talks to students in schools and trying to get them to understand better what the experiences were like in the camps. She made a series of 15 paintings in this faux naïf manner. This is not the style she used as a professional artist. It was specifically devised for the children to read these paintings to understand better. Stojka also taught occasionally students in different contexts, and she was very careful to differentiate which paintings she took because many of them, in her view, were not suitable for children. But I'm putting it up in part to show that Stojka's work is not illustrative. It's not telling stories. It's working in quite different terms. By the end of the 90s, her approach had become more venturesome, less traditional, if you like, more overtly modern, both formally and stylistically. The one on the left, untitled, sometimes called Burgundy Soup, it's rare in presenting a group of male figures close up. The skin of the emaciated, abbreviated bodies is a dour grey beige. Their oversized feet and hands, each digit elaborated, reach out to clutch the precariously placed crimson bowls, the preciousness of whose contents is indicated by dabs of bright yellow and orange impasto. Survivor stories stress the necessity of safeguarding one's bowl and spoon. Without them, there was no way to receive the sparse daily ration of soup, and the internee would face starvation. In her memoirs relating to her time in the camps, Stojka returns obsessively to the subject of the SS officers' polished leather footwear, so different from the ill-fitting mismatched shoes supplied to prisoners. Whenever the boots neared, she felt quivers of fear run through her body. Military footwear featured prominently in her paintings for several years, on each occasion in a very different formulation. I'm showing you here a relatively small painting. It's about 2 feet, 24 inches high from 2001, which I think is the most compelling of the group because of the way it deftly structures the viewer's engagement. Isolated on a grey ground, the highly polished boots become a synecdoche for power and authority. Seen from a low vantage and close to, the monumental forms produce a visceral effect in the viewer, congruent with feelings of powerlessness the artist experienced as a child when in their presence. On the left, you see her first representation of a camp in the post-war era. It's a surprisingly lyrical image of Auschwitz-Birkenau, I think. It was conceived in response to contemporary events, as the text on the back explains. We see 2 memorials interspersed amongst the densely packed ruins of the crematoria chimneys on the well-maintained site. The quiescent scene, a warm sunny day, is rendered in an unusually high-keyed palette of pinks, buttery yellows, and juicy greens. In the early 90s, civic authorities in Auschwitz approved a proposal to build a supermarket on the site of the former camp. Following a public outcry, which was widely covered in the press, the project was cancelled. In her comments on the verso, Stojka argues that the dead must be allowed to rest in peace, and I think that's really gives the painting its or identifies its tenor. But elsewhere, she pointed to the irony of building a supermarket on a site where internees were starved to death. Also a memorializing image, Auschwitz 1944 on the right, is one of relatively few paintings from her last years. The once barren ground beneath the watchtower, on which the name of the camp and the date, 1944, is inscribed, has grown into a field with flowers. Ravens wheel overhead, a spectral chimney belches smoke. In late July 1944, those internees deemed fit for forced labor, which included Stojka and her mother, were dispatched from the segregated Roma camp within Auschwitz-Birkenau and sent to Ravensbrück. On the night of August 2nd, the remnant, some 4,000 Roma, were gassed. Late that same year, as Soviet forces advanced, the Nazis sought to erase all evidence of what had taken place at this site of industrialized killing, forcing the remaining inmates to set out on death marches to camps within Germany. They then destroyed the crematoria and gas chambers. The presence of the birds, the ravens, which for Stojka are the souls of the dead, together with the ghostly ruin, imply that the past doesn't vanish. It haunts the present. So now I want to turn to the center wall, which you see here, which has a different kind of subject matter. As I said, these subjects here relate to the natural world with its seasonal and diurnal rhythms. In the aughts, Stojka came to view nature increasingly as an enduring and reparative force, to a counter to horrors perpetrated by humankind. Characteristically, her choice of motifs was selective, but the terms in which the images are realized are wide-ranging, from the naturalistic to the visionary and the rhapsodic. You see here this visionary painting of the all-seeing eye. It's sometimes called the eye of providence or the eye of God. It's a well-known symbol with a storied history, and this eye oversees the natural world. In Stojka's version, the sclera is blighted, the floaters are Nazi insignia, and the landscape it surveys has been laid waste. Stojka talked a lot about the Roma's love of birds, an identification likely based in part on the fact that birds are not confined by terrestrial borders. The exception that was made of the raven, which they regarded with foreboding in large part. Birds feature prominently in her art, and above all the ravens, whose significance shifts, but mostly they represent the souls of the murdered. This painting at the top left, in which you see the birds interspersed with swastikas, is titled Corpses. Here you see the backside of that center wall. And again, two images, one visionary, the other's of natural world. This image is based on a nightmare the artist had the evening before she made her first return visit to Bergen-Belsen in 2003. She dreamt that the graves opened, the bodies emerged, and then floated up to constitute a fantastical avian creature, what she called a human grave bird. Brought up Catholic, Stojka maintained a lifelong devotion to Mary, Mother of God, as seen in depictions of wayside chapels in the Austrian countryside and some of her pastoral landscapes. Religious imagery, however, I think, also informs her works in more subtle and unexpected ways. Here, perhaps, there's an echo of eschatological texts, which state that on the day of judgment, the dead will come out of their tombs to be judged. The saved will ascend to heaven, while the damned will be dispatched to eternal hellfire. Though she didn't visit museums or galleries, Stojka was visually astute and absorbed a wide range of visual culture, not least surrealism, which had been quickly absorbed into mass culture in the post-war decades. Television, which was always on in her apartment, was one among many likely sources. In the 90s, the nightly news on one of the two state channels then available in Austria was followed by a cultural program. Okay. In 2004, Stojka was given a solo exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Vienna. It seems to have been confined to a single gallery and contained a number of small works on paper of extermination camp subjects, as well as notebooks and a genealogical tree with small sculptures representing her family members, most of whom had perished in the Holocaust. Dominating the room was a wall of flowers. The title, Ceija Stojka Leben, says it all. Stojka wrote the fact that her dark, that is the camp subjects, as opposed to her light subjects like these, were preferred by audiences. Critics and curators, too, have tended to dismiss the flower paintings, wrongly, I think, as sentimental and nostalgic. The flowers she prioritized are robust varietals, mostly sunflowers and poppies, very different from the delicate cultivars found in domestic gardens, bouquets, and wreaths. Prized for their hardiness and abundance, the varietals in her paintings were grown as cash crops and harvested for seeds and oils. In their protein abundance, the poppies take on a rhapsodic quality. In the more tempered image on the right, the brushstrokes that define the sunflowers, which are emblems of the Roma, are thick and juicy, but the row of withered trees flanking the field is handled more dryly. For the remainder of the talk, I'll now turn to drawings in the small back gallery. Never studies for paintings, they're artworks in their own right. Mostly small in scale, they focus on subjects relating to the camps. What I say, in the absence of a catalogue raisonné, must remain speculative. But I think that drawings came to be a dominant medium in the aughts. And this may have something to do with her declining health and or a sense of urgency as she aged. If you look quickly at the middle one on that wall, and you can see two figures obliquely with speech bubbles and text. They're from that particular work's from the same year as these two. The subjects of the relatively few drawings from the 90s are the SS. As you see here, the expressionist pen and ink studies, sometimes enlivened with crimson touches, quickly move from the anecdotal to the metaphoric. Their features contorted with anger and spite, the SS spew vitriol, too foul perhaps to be spelt out in words. A small watercolor made 2 years later, They Devoured Us, shows a gaping maw, a figurative embodiment of the porhemos, or the devouring, the term, as I said, which was widely used at the time for the Roma Holocaust. These works relate in turn to a large untitled painting from 1995 on the right, which is amongst Stojka's best-known works. It's a meter wide, and this one is tiny, maybe 12 inches high. So it's a false comparison in some ways. The one on the right, an outlier in her work. There are very few paintings of single figures, and it stems from an incident she experienced as a searing assault. As if in play, an SS officer bent over and put his head between his legs, only to viciously tease her. "You think you can escape me? I've got you, hee hee hee." And this is written, the text is written on the back. Decades later, that charged memory became the point of departure for a painting that depicts a grotesque, misshapen figure who appears to be uncomfortably close to the picture plane. His body blocks out the verdant field in which he stands. This is manifestly not a concentration camp site. As his steely blue eyes transfix his interlocutor, us, the viewers, the monstrous ogre, with his leering grin, reveals himself to be the stuff of folk and fairy tales. In making this claim, I'm not saying that Stojka consciously borrowed from such sources as her grandchildren's illustrated books. She didn't need to. She came from a culture with a rich oral tradition of storytelling, and as I said, she was brought up in the Roman Catholic faith. Monsters, ogres, and satanic figures are part of the repertoire of subjects she would have absorbed in her youth and likely passed on to her children and grandchildren. The point I'm making is that this image mines a shared legacy constellated around cautionary tales of fear and threat that's familiar to audiences of all ages across race, ethnicity, and class. It's not an autobiographical painting. It has an autobiographical beginning, but it's something much more and much more layered. As we've seen in relation to the painting of the SS officer's boots, when revisiting age-specific moments of personal trauma, Stojka didn't make pictures with self-referential allusions. Rather, she recast the incident imaginatively, mobilizing broader implications in well-established cultural traditions in ways that deepen and amplify the work's currency. Psychoanalysts and cognitive psychologists draw lines separating the various phases of childhood. One boundary is the age of 11, which marks an important stage in logical reasoning. Younger children are capable of understanding that they're in danger and must behave or not behave in certain ways, but a 10-year-old doesn't have the capacity to contextualize the experience, think about it, and process it in the way that an adult would. And what's so interesting or perplexing, perhaps, is there seem to be no comparable examples to the boots, say, or the ogre figure of motifs repeated and transformed over time associated with her internment in Ravensbrück or Bergen-Belsen, that is, from the time she was 11 or older. And I show you here, talk about the one on the right, which figures the notoriously brutal young female SS, Dorothea Binz. It takes the form of a genre subject and shows her inspecting Ashen internees. None of the images that Stojka makes as I said, in Bergen-Belsen or in Ravensbrück, seem to me to have the multi-layered complex meanings that inform the Auschwitz examples. And I could speculate why, but perhaps it's something to discuss in the Q&A. In conclusion, I'll focus on several drawings that center on the final solution, the planned genocide of Jews and Roma, for which Stojka developed a new vocabulary. Distilled and abbreviated, these works depend on metaphor and expressive abstraction. And I want to compare two images of the liquidation of the remnant of the Roma camp at Auschwitz on the night of August 2nd, 1994, when some 4,000 internees, as I said, were gassed. The earlier version, the one on the left, is very large, 39 inches across, and it shows the SS rounding up the victims in the drawing style that she'd used in the 90s. The second, made 4 years later, on the right, is altogether different. The perpetrators are absent. We look through what appears to be the porthole of the gas chamber. The atmosphere is hazy from the Zyklon B that's being pumped into the space. Rendered in delicate washes, the image feels tenuous, unstable. Unlike the early one, it doesn't appeal to deal with factuality, but traffics in the greater truths that fiction or visions can offer. And here I'm reminded of Paul Klee's dictum that art doesn't represent the visible, it makes visible. The image on the right, this is a tender image rendered in thin washes of pale yellows and crimsons, the color of dried blood. It shows mothers nurturing their infants in extremis, in the midst of horror. They didn't know whether they would be saved that day. They could just likely have been sent to the gas chambers. On the right, you see Auschwitz, untitled Auschwitz 1944 without words. Her technique for conjuring these ethereal forms doesn't permit reworking. Her hand is very sure. These are two details from that less clear image. Stojka's turn towards abstraction was in sync with the wider cultural shifts, which by the late 20th century saw abstraction as the appropriate language in which to memorialize the Holocaust. Think of Peter Eisenman's 2005 memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe here in Berlin. I don't mean to suggest that Stojka's alignment, to the degree that it exists, was the outcome of a conscious decision on her part to work more abstractly, but rather that she was in tune with the zeitgeist. The fact that she was uncredentialed, that she had no formal art school training, didn't isolate her from contemporary cultural trends, as so often is claimed. Untitled to the Crematorium evokes a group of weary, dispirited figures. It was made by dragging her fingers, coated with medium, across the sheet. In the second, paint spills and pools. Written in the middle of the image, a field of ash, is the word tot, dead. A dry brush makes bare marks, conjuring a figure, perhaps male, on the right, who appears to gesture towards a female figure and child. The improvisatory assurance with which she deploys her minimal means is stunning. This last image, small, approximately 12 inches square, has no other, it's peerless. There's nothing else in her oeuvre, to my knowledge, like it. Based on stylistic evidence, it appears to be one of her last paintings. Were it not for the text along the lower edge, it would be difficult to pass. In her brilliant book, Crises of Memory and the Second World War, published in 2006, Suzanne Suleiman speaks of the surge in memory studies, both based in the private and the collective, that had its origins in the 1980s. The locus classicus for that outpouring was the Holocaust. 2 decades later, Suleiman writes, and I'm quoting, "Now that we have so many straightforward accounts, which of course must be preserved and archived, we will have to think about what actually will endure and continue to be meaningful to people who aren't a specialist and who have no personal connection to these events." Her conclusion, which I've slightly rephrased, is that works of artistic merit, however one interprets the term, have a greater chance to endure than others, for they produce the most complex understandings of self and world, both on the part of the artist and that of the viewers. Making visible makes the case for Stojka's place in that canon. Thank you. No, I think they decided we should. I'll just take questions.
Okay,
if that's okay.
The question.
But can I ask? Would you like to ask the first question?
I do have so many questions. It's so impressive, I have to say. Thank you very much. And go on, a little bit silly question. How did you become acquainted with her work?
Oh, I saw an exhibition in Paris in 2018. It was the first big solo exhibition at La Maison Rouge. And then that exhibition has traveled to 5 different countries since. And in February 2020, it was in Madrid. And I happened to be there and I saw it. And I came back literally as the lockdown started to the US with the goal of making a show of her work in the US.
And was it the start of thinking about a project you are now following up at the Academy, The Child in the War?
It's about, yes, the theme of the child, childhood, war, displacement, exile. It's
so she's one of the examples?
Yes, she would be a starting point. Yeah. Because I think this exhibition will start during the Second World War for a variety of reasons, and it will come to the present. And she spans that pretty much.
And when and where will it be on show?
It will take a long time, and I'm looking for venues to take it. If you have any thoughts.
Thank you. Finish.
Yes, the point of my standing...
It's better not to be alone.
Yes. No, the point is so I can move the slides in case we want to look at something else. Right.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this very thoughtful lecture. I was wondering, what is the significance of the very exact dates, like 2nd of March 2006?
It was a habit she developed. She didn't do it all the time. And you may have noticed in some of the late ones, she doesn't date them. But it's an incredible gift to an art historian because there's so little documentation and she had relatively few shows and the works are untitled. The one thing that was possible is to lay the whole thing out in a chronological order.
It's a sort of diary.
Yes, it's. I think it's a concern with the historical moment. No, the moment of making. Mm-hmm. It's not the moment in which and
experience
that kind of thing between. She obviously, and she's painting 50 years after the years she was in the camps. She's not painting the subjects in the order of which she. So it would be very confusing to make an exhibition in a standard way when you lay out the works in a chronological order, maybe group them thematically, so a viewer can see the early work and how it develops and what the themes are and whatever, because the subjects would be also various. So what curators have tended to do is lay them out so they follow the life. But that way you can't see what's going on in her work as an artist, and what it suborns the work to a life story.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Lynne, for this. I'd love to hear you talk more about what you were just starting to hit on now, which is maybe the curator's challenge of both addressing the events behind the artist's work, but also foregrounding the imaginative process as opposed to biography. And I was really interested in the mapping out that you had of the gallery space in Drawing Center. And maybe I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about both the space, the geography of this, but also how you worked with that in foregrounding this imaginative labor.
Thank you, Maza. The one thing I didn't want to do was start with a timeline, and it's too much for people to take in. It's off-putting. Many people, statistics say, today in the US don't know about the Holocaust. So you have to start with the work and putting them on this purple wall, which is arresting, and putting two pictures, one with the tattoo and one with the world turning, sets her up as a survivor of the Holocaust. On the backside, you see kind of the center of her existence in her commitment, the shaping of her by this traditional traveler's life. And so that belonged on the other side, the flip side of the wall. And then by keeping everything else white, it became a fulcrum in the gallery. And then putting the camp subjects around the perimeter established a zone that relates to the historical and the geographically specific. And the center relates to another kind of time and to her growing commitment to nature. Because there's a certain moment where she stops painting scenes with signs of the Roma in landscape. That's when the flowers really take over. And I think as you exit, if you go back through the first room, you'd have your back to the purple wall. You'd see on the left this painting, which is singular. There's nothing like it. It's made in 1999, which is a pivotal moment, a moment of loss, I would say, both personal and collective. So the site is based on one of the family's favorite campsites. She talks about an arbor with 3 sturdy trees. No sign of the Roma. Instead, you see small birds here. And the golden ground, I think, is like an icon in some ways. And the loss was the loss of her partner, her life partner, and the same moment, the time that she saw she could not represent those scenes of a lost culture and way of life. So that's on your left, and on the right, there's that painting, which I've talked about. And the other thing was putting to me, it was the best way of giving a sense of her was through these marvelous documentaries by Karen Berger, who was a close friend of hers and who edited her memoirs. And they feature the artist speaking. You learn an immense amount.
There are a lot of books to see in the threshold of your exhibition. And is it the poetry of Ceija Stojka?
Yes, there are both books about Roma culture and there are novels, Imre Kertész and Primo Levi's
but
writers.
Not her own stories.
Yes, hers as well. Yeah. So it's a mixture. And the museum makes available links and sheets of paper for visitors to take with links to Roma histories, to histories of the Holocaust, and so on, for people who want to follow up.
Ja, bitte. With the golden earrings.
Thank you so much for that. I'm curious that it seems that in the drawing center, there was very little wall text, if any, and yet we know from your talk that she wrote on the back of her works. So I'm wondering what informed your curatorial decision to not have wall text, and did you handle the information on the backs of the works? How did you, if at all, integrate some narrative with the works that you displayed?
Thank you. There was an exhibition guide, which you picked up at the beginning. It had a skeletal map with arrows, just go here, turn around, go around. And then the object labels, which are the name, the date, spare labels, would have a dot at the bottom right-hand corner if there was writing on the back. And there you could see the text. And to me, it's preferable. You can hold it and you can look. It also means, with a small work of art, you're not standing in front of the image, you're blocking it from someone else when you're reading a text.
Next question, please.
Thank you so much, Lynne. This is great. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about why it took her so long to start with the artwork, and in thinking about that, I'm wondering if there's kind of can we read some of this artwork as delayed resistance to something that she couldn't do when she was a child, but then, you know, and then the hearing about the kind of the story of how she then took up art as, can it be read as kind of resistance later on in life?
What she would have made as a 13-year-old coming out of the camps is obviously hugely different from this. In terms of the question of delayed response, I'm not obviously an expert in trauma studies, but maybe someone with that kind of specialization could say something. In terms of what she said, several times she recounts an incident of being on the street in Vienna, a local neighborhood perhaps, one day, and she never hid the tattoo. And there were these kids, and they saw it, and they started shrieking, "The Holocaust never happened, you're a lie, this is untrue." And she said she was really shaken. She went home, and she determined she was presumably going to write and paint. But she didn't take up painting specifically to that end. It was really fortuitous. She'd been in Japan on a cultural tour, and she'd visited a kindergarten. And of course, there were language barriers, and the kids were making paintings. So she said through the translator that she'd ask her grandchildren to make some paintings and she'd send them back. Well, her grandchildren didn't feel like doing it. So she took up their watercolors and she made them and sent them back. And she found it interesting. And at first, it wasn't, she didn't set out to, I think, with the previous explanation in mind. But she quickly saw that she could use it that way. And she had an exhibition within a year of even playing around with paintings at Ammerlinghaus, which was a cultural center in Vienna, which specialized in foregrounding the culture of minorities and the Roma above all. 91, and then again in 93. And by 93, I think the painting I didn't talk about, there was one of the Ravensbrück camp seen from above. That's from 92, and that's really when she gets going. There are people start late in life. I think it's a case-by-case account.
But before she did a lot of writing, as I learned.
She did, but in the 80s, yes. Yeah. And it was Karen Berger who collated all that, typed it out, found a publisher. Yeah. So again, it didn't start out it became a memoir. It didn't start that way. And what I've been trying to say is the memoir works as autobiographical, as memoirs do, accounts, narratives and storytelling. The paintings are not, in my view, paintings of autobiography. They're paintings that are doing something else. And I think this confusion comes about because the autobiography provides all these, the backstory, as do the notes and annotations. And the supposition is, well, if that's what's all around it, the paintings must be telling a story too.
Next question, please. Yeah.
I really thank you for a very great retrospective of the artist. I think a lot of people today will probably realize that the art truly does have no boundaries. And as a distinguished curator yourself, what do you see in the future when you see art curated like this from self-taught artists? Do you think this is a new sort of wave of art that's going to be coming through, sort of just generally, that like self-taught artists are given a platform to show their work? Obviously through this, Ceija has really shown sort of her own biography through paintings. Do you think this is going to be a new kind of self-expression for new artists, or a self-taught artist, should we say?
Mikhail alluded to an exhibition I made. Outliers, yes. And American Vanguard art that looked at the way uncredentialed artists had been brought into the mainstream at different times over the 20th century for quite different reasons, and always by vanguard artists who saw in the work of the self-taught something authentic, something, primitive was a term that was used often at the time, or folk, but regarded it as equal with their own in some way. It's my view now, having spent a lot of time with that, there are people who work in small communities, slightly cut off, or who have mental disabilities, who may be working in an isolated way. And maybe their art is not particularly addressed to community, and it's not strongly impacted by the environments in which they live. For the rest, frankly, I don't use the term. I don't like the term. I think it's misleading, and it's especially meaning in her case because I think she doesn't qualify. She's not isolated. The term outsider, which is used in the US a lot, was coined in the 80s, and the 70s by Roger Cardinal. And the stereotype is of an isolated, hermetic, inward-turning person who's channeling, without mediation, these drives from within, and who's indifferent to reception and community. That's entirely bogus. Even Roger Cardinal came to say, this is not the way any kind of artist works. And
artists always didn't know it before. Think of Picasso, think of Dubuffet and Arbrut and so on. The artists were always interested in this so-called primitive and foreground. Yeah.
Yes, but in her case, she's working in the 90s in Vienna. She's in the midst of a visual culture. Yeah. She doesn't go to museums. She's seeing stuff all the time. Surrealism, as I said, is part of mass culture. You don't have to look at a Dali to see works in advertising being made that way. She's watching television with cultural programs. Caspar David Friedrich is at the height of the reclamation of his career in the 90s. So the shows in Vienna, you can't miss this. And she's visually curious and alert. And as I said, she's brought up in the Catholic faith. She's, stories, biblical illustrations. All of this is grist to her mill. It doesn't make her someone self-taught. It makes her, like many artists, vanguard artists and others, Francis Bacon, Robert Ryman, they did not go to art school. It's not, there's no categorical distinction in my mind.
Next question, yeah.
My thanks also for this lecture. I just wanted to maybe follow up on this and wonder if the division that is so often drawn is not necessarily in the artist, but often also through an industry behind it, giving it completely different ways of working in media, expensive bronze, canvases, and less coming from the inside practice?
Well, she used standard materials, high-quality materials.
Well, maybe I'm not just talking about the materials itself, but like having an industry behind them that kind of, with framing, with writing about it, with discourse behind it, just props people up in a different way, and therefore it draws divisions that might not be distinguishable if one would just look at the work.
Certainly, in terms of a standard career, hers started slowly. She was represented by a wonderful gallery called Kai Dickas, which is here in Berlin, the first gallery to be dedicated to Roma artists. And the inaugural show was a show of her work here in 2012. So she entered the mainstream circuit. She also was shown in the Jewish Museum in Vienna. She was shown in Ravensbrück at the Memorial Museum there. She was shown in Kunstverein and other galleries. So it's not, but she didn't have the David Zwirner Gallery behind her. But many artists don't. Many artists don't.
So one last question, please. Yeah. Oder zusammen.
Thank you so much. I'm, of course, deeply touched by the story, but also completely blown away by the paintings and stuff that can only happen in a painting happens there. And if I understood correctly, you hinted at something that happened between the way she was painting the Auschwitz themed and the Ravensbrück themed, that there was a difference.
Yes.
Would you mind saying more?
Okay. Sorry, it was probably very abbreviated. Psychoanalysts and clinical psychologists talk about these stages in childhood and what a 10-year-old can conceive and hold and understand about experience, and what an 11-year-old took later. On those theories, a 10-year-old, and she was 9 approaching 10 when she was deported. So the year in Auschwitz is when she's 10. So things are impacting her. I mean, they would impact anyone. This horrendous deportation trip, the confinement that the fence represents, the boots. I mean, it's a period of intense difficulty. And maybe when she went to Ravensbrück, which was a women's forced labor camp, it was a different situation, and marginally less punitive. Maybe she was inured more. I would say that the great good fortune she had was she was with her mother the whole time. And her mother was a wise, extraordinary woman of great fortitude who managed to keep 4 of her 5 children alive. There was smaller. Ceija was the second youngest. The youngest died of typhus. She she was able to do that. And that, I think, as much as anything, probably accounts for, and particularly since they're in a somewhat better situation in Ravensbrück, she was impacted differently.
Well, thank you very much. The public, the American Academy, and me, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.